test for anybody that's approaching my age. Hey there, hi there, ho there, you're as welcome as can be. Anybody tell me what that's from? You.
Mickey Mouse.
All right, but you're not that old. Okay, now I got to get on this pretty quick because I got way too much to just idle chatter. Everybody knows I like to pull things apart and look at them structurally, morphologically, life history, behavior. All of that's a really important aspect of butterfly study or any study of any creature. But the creature has to interact with its cosmos. And this interaction is described in terms of its place over time on the face of our particular planet. That's the only one we know much about. So biogeography is an adjunct to many other sciences, and there's no naturalist who's not also a biogeographer. Study of the distribution of species spatially and temporally. It's a synthetic science, including aspects of geography, biology, soil science, geology, climatology, ecology, and evolution. But it's also tied to concepts of species, and in fact, when you examine the species in the context of their distribution over the planet, you can see that there's juxtapositions that are important, and you have to understand these juxtapositions in terms of their history, which is admittedly somewhat theoretical. And we're also interested, as a biogeographer, in mechanisms related to the expansion and contraction of ranges. And of course, most of us are limited in time. Some of us less so, some of us more so. But the problem with the time and temporal limitations of the human lifespan is we don't see much going on as we watch it. So we have to infer from the evidence, okay? And we're going to cover some of that ground tonight. Okay, the pattern of species distribution across a geographic area can be explained through combination of the individual species adaptability, its capacity to disperse, and then various historical factors. Speciation, differentiation, extinction, continental drift, climatic revolutions are especially important in this part of the world. And then, of course, available resources in the environment and the ability of the species to adapt to those resources. Okay, now, let's see if this works. Okay, this is like a generalized map of North America, but the important thing here is I want to emphasize is butterflies are not maritime, they're not marine creatures. Therefore, the terrestrial limitations impose themselves on butterflies. This is about as far north as butterflies occur, right, in this area here. And actually on this part, I'm the same latitude essentially, but on this part of Greenland. The nature of this, okay, that came out better than I thought it would. It's really important to understand the nature of a continental mass is very, very diverse according to the size of the continent. Small continent has less of a montane element to it, and in contrast with the element of the plains. But one of the things that you have to look at is what constitutes a life zone. What is eligible for creatures to live on? Well, you can see that they're pretty much not eligible to live on ice. That's really important when you consider glacial epochs, because creatures don't live on or under ice. At least that's what I think. I don't know, maybe. Little bladder might. I don't know.
Well, cave organisms do.
Yes. Okay. This is a very generalized and, in fact, a pretty much disregarded life zone map. It's something that's kind of become passé because, in fact, biotic zones are much more diverse, and in order to taxonomically array a continent the size of North America, you make so many assumptions that it's better not to, all right? But you can see that there's this large area, sort of a forest taiga. They don't really show the Arctic environment, which is tundra, it's treeless. Then you have these prairies, so you have a coastal zone, Piedmont, and then the Great Basin, etc. This is more of a paradigm that shouldn't be taken too seriously than anything else. I just wanted to show that a continent the size of North America can be divided into grosser regions. Now, one of the things that's very, very interesting is that when you look at all these mountain ranges here, like we know that these are significant. There's butterflies that occur in mountain and there's butterflies that occur in the Columbia Basin or in the Puget Trough. But what do you think about butterflies that live in the Puget Trough ever moving up into the Columbia Basin? All right. Well, you can see that the potential for that is there along the Columbia River Gorge, and it was about 5-6 years ago we had a meeting in the Columbia Gorge that talked exactly about this. This Columbia River Gorge is a potential pathway for dispersal between these two regions. Okay. And the reason that it has to be is that butterflies that live in lowland regions probably do so because they're adapted to that, and climbing mountains isn't a part of their biology. They may come to that eventually, but it's just one of the things that in an immediate sense is not within their capacity. Likewise, montane things are not as likely to jump the gap because there's a river there and there's lowlands and everything else. And there's quite a few butterflies that are distributed in this region and in this region that are different between the two regions. And so we have to look at corridors of dispersal. Montane corridors, I mean, you're going to see a lot of things that are in common in the montane habitats. You're going to see a lot of things in common with lowland. Even though this isn't exactly a lowland habitat, it is a high desert, which has much in common ecologically with the Columbia Basin, okay? Now, there's a few things we need to understand before we get too deep into the mapping, which is really where I'm headed and as quickly as possible. And one is adaptations and pre-adaptations. You can say, for instance, that an adaptation is something that an animal does to meet the needs of its habitat. And it's obviously, if you get to a place and you settle down and you start to become familiar, you become more and more adapted to the rigors of that habitat. But there's something about butterflies in the Northwest that all you should know, and that is that most of them weren't here 15,000 years ago, so they're all rather recent. And in fact, if you think about glaciation, it is something that's pulsed back and forth, and so this recency and this constant reoccurrence in an area from whence you've been vacated in a prior glaciation is a fact of life in the Northwest. And this is part of the reason why we have relatively few species in the northern latitudes and relatively more species in the tropics, is that in the tropics there isn't so much of this mass extinction. There's fractionation and recompilation, but there's nothing like glaciers to just wipe everything out. And then the other aspect is pre-adaptation, and we consider the European cabbage white, the small white as they call it in Europe, as pre-adapted to North America. I judge that to be so on the basis of the fact that it was first recorded in 1863, and then by 1890 it was transcontinental. It would seem to me that qualifies as a pre-adaptation to the North America. Obviously, a lot of habitats in Europe are similar to those here, but I think the predisposition of human beings to raise brassicaceous plants, cabbage family plants, gave it a head start. Another thing you need to think about is the notion of climax versus cirral habitats. Okay, a climax habitat is a habitat that, if left to itself, reaches a certain stage. We might call, for instance, an old-growth forest in western Washington, a hemlock-Doug fir forest in the lowlands of Puget Sound, with 250-foot tall trees, etc., as sort of a climax. It's like it gets to a point where there's not much going to change. Trees will die, but there's old trees there. And there's not much new growth, not much change in the structure of the species and whatnot in these habitats. Well, as we all know, that a lot of times you go into places that have been burned, the stages of recovery are exceedingly important to the many different animals that utilize these interim stages. There's higher diversity of herbs and forests, and so it's very, very important for a lot of creatures to have these cirral stages. Now, there are semi-cirral, like landslide, avalanche slopes and things like that. But in fact, we could say that in some cases, there's been a lot of catastrophic kinds of events that have been very important historically. Volcanic events, for instance, in and around right down here, there's all these pumice fields associated with Mount Mazama, and that imposes a specialized habitat. In and around Mount Baker, we have a similar kind of thing where there's I don't want to say artificial habitat, but a habitat imposed upon by soil characteristics of drainage. And then we have a lot of species ranges right in this area here that have been impacted by the glacier peak blowout some years ago. So the climax SEER is a very important thing to think about. Also in terms of the glaciers, glaciers leave, they have this, this rejuvenation of the habitat post-glacial. That's a serial progression, okay? Another thing that's important is recognize that there's an upper and lower timberline. Everyone talks about timberline in the sense of the alpine timberline, but in fact, there's a low elevation timberline, and that is where a steppe meets the forest, okay? And this is a low elevation timberline versus a high elevation. You could go, for instance, from Mazama to Slate Peak, and you're kind of at the low elevations. In Mazama, you see the open steppe country, and then as you get to Slate Peak, you get the high elevation. Now, structurally, the steppe and alpine habitats are very similar. And in fact, step back, as you get into these regions here, the alpine corridors merge with the Arctic. They become the same, so that higher and lower timberlines absolutely become the same. It's important to recognize that has happened in our state. For instance, Sheridan's Green Hairstreak, which is largely found in Columbia Basin and peripheral areas, extends all the way up to alpine habitats at Slate Peak and all throughout central British Columbia. And that's because at one time they were allowed to disperse into these alpine habitats, and then as the forests became predominant and separated the two zones again, they just went their own ways. And so that's an important function of understanding how one adaptability can serve two purposes in terms of an eventual distribution.
Hey John, where is Slate Peak?
Right about there.
Right there.
Right. I mean, I think that's the Okanagan Railing. Yeah, it's right about there somewhere. Okay, now another thing that we need to look at is, these are the life zones. Again, this is a fashionable thing. I mean, I don't really think this is Colorado. It's like, 5,000 feet in Washington, you're getting close to, subalpine. 11,500 feet, you're in, permanent ice. But basically, what we have is this zonation that takes place over a mountain. I put that in there because it was a nice slide. This is a very nice slide. I'd like to pass it around sometime. I don't know if you can, I wasn't sure that you can read that, but you see potential evapotranspiration ratio, and then here, it's annual precipitation in millimeters, and then this is biotemperature, which roughly coordinates the latitude. And so you see at the highest latitudes, way up here, you have essentially what amounts to desert. And an ultimate desert is exactly that. Deserted, no life, nothing. There's hard rock and nothing living there. That's like the northern end of Ellesmere Island. And then as you go further down in latitude, you have these variations according to how much moisture is in the environment. And at the lowest latitudes, you go from rainforest to desert. Okay, desert seems to be a function of all of these latitudes, and that is, of course, a precipitation factor. Okay, now we're going to talk about refugia, and I want to do it in the context of like total glacial mass. And this is, nobody took a satellite photo of Pleistocene. We didn't get one of those, but this is approximately, what we're talking about here. And you notice that with all this huge ice mass, there are places that were unglaciated. Now, these are also functions of precipitation. There were areas that just didn't get enough precipitation for the snow. Now, it wasn't blasted cold. It surely was. But the fact is, when you have areas that are unglaciated, there's a potential for creatures to live there. In fact, a lot of these places now are not much more hospitable than they were during the Ice Age. And so the creatures that were there are often still there. Okay, and you'll also notice that there's these corridors, ice-free corridors. Now, nobody knows this for sure, but there's enough evidence in distribution of present-day distribution of different animals, and some of the work that's been done with pollen samples from bogs and whatnot to establish that this is fairly likely. Also, humans are considered to have dispersed down this corridor. That's the only way to explain their presence in some places. So when you have a situation, let's see, I'm going to do a little jumping around again. Okay, I wanted to show, this is what the continental North America, again, not a satellite photo, looked like about 3 million years ago before glaciation. And this is during the max glaciation, and this is what it looks like afterwards. You see that, the Hudson Bay was carved out. I mean, it was a major deal. It was about 5 or 6 miles deep, and it's like grinding glass out of a telescope mirror. Okay, now this is a better idea of what a refugium might be. And that is an area where ice does not cover the geographic region. It may be peripheral to the ice mass, but there's reason to suspect actually there were refugia in the high Arctic. And a refugium simply is a place that's ice-free that is capable of supporting life, and therefore becomes a reservoir for post-glacial dispersal. And we have a lot of reasons to believe this happened, some of it provable.
It's called Mount Ararat.
Huh?
Mount Ararat.
Who are you calling a rat? Oh, an Ararat.
John, why is that long strip, north-south strip, not considered a refugium?
It's, you mean the one that was on the previous map?
Yeah.
That thing? It's hard actually to prove any of this. This is stylized, okay? This is even more stylized. You can kind of see what they were getting at here, but maybe, it's like, they were more interested obviously in this part, and we'll get to some of that in a minute. I got to throw some stuff in here, okay, before we get to the maps. I'm afraid I'm going to run out of time. Okay, now vicariance is an interesting phenomenon. This is a kind of a stylized map again of what the world looked like at the lowest sea levels during the glacial maximum. Right. Well, I'll just move on. This is Chukotkin Peninsula, Kamchatka, and this is the Alaska and the Aleutians and everything. You can see this one large landmass, and it was, again, as I mentioned, largely unglaciated. Well, this has two important factors that we have to consider. One is the large landmass that's not glaciated becomes a reservoir for dispersal. And by the way, this dispersal it's proved to have gone both ways. Taxa came from the New World, went to the Old. Taxa came from the Old World, went to the New. And we have reason to believe that some of them did, twice. Came to the Old World and differentiated, came back to the New World as something different. Okay, and that's the basis of some of the molecular evidence. But the important thing here is to recognize that this no longer exists. This became no longer a corridor, but a barrier. All right, and that's a vicariant event. No longer is there free exchange across these two land masses between various populations on either side, and therefore there's the opportunity for differentiation to take place, and therefore according to classic models of speciation, the potential for the evolution of different species. Now there are interesting factors, volcanic eruptions being another one of those things that can contribute to vicariant events. But another factor in all of this, I borrowed this picture because it kind of brings you as a unit. It wasn't great. Are relictual populations, and we'll see examples of this later on. That's where the main body of a range is in one place, and then there's outliers that seem totally out of place. What that generally reflects is that there was once upon a time a larger range, and all that remains of that larger range are fragmented populations that managed to survive. And then there's what's called endemism, which is the presence of a taxon in a unique geographic region. Geographic religion. I'll look into that,
Yeah.
Anyway, the bottom line is that endemics can be identified more by the restriction of the range than by the cause for that. Now, nobody's really been able to figure out what's going on with that. We'll talk about that. Now, I want to get to dispersal, because this is what's really going on here, all right? I gotta go through this. All right, this is a range that we see very frequently. It's modified, stylized. In other words, a basic boreal Rocky Mountain Cascade range. It's important to recognize that if you look at where the glacier is and then you back up and look at this range, you can see that what the glacier does is essentially bisects this range, okay? And one can say, well, maybe these populations extend further to the south, or you can say all kinds of things, but it's very, very likely that some events, and apparently from molecular data, this kind of thing would separate what was a once continuous population into two. That's also essentially a vicariant event. And you can see that there's potential for the same ice sheet, that we're talking about here, bumping, a population, pushing it further south, and then after the glaciers leave, they move back in. This is the Great Plains. It's like this is a natural corridor all the way up. We see a lot of populations, of different creatures, not just butterflies, that have a distribution like this. Sometimes further to the east, sometimes further to the south. It's more in terms of a model I'm kind of trying to establish here. And then this is a classic. This is the one that is more frequent. We see, if you look at where that glaciation is again, and then you look at a range like this, it's almost impossible to, obviously, these populations weren't where they were during the glacial epoch. You could imagine this whole thing being shoved south, and so it's what they call the telescoping effect. They can only get shoved south so far, which is the Gulf of Mexico, and then maybe in hospitable regions in Mexico. But the whole concept is that the movement of ranges. Now, you say this movement, it's not, it's extinction events a lot of times. These creatures are able to disperse, and of course, if it gets colder, they're liable to move away or to just die out. So extinction is an important function of all of this in these observations, okay? But you'll also notice that, because you have this cordilleran thing going on here, this mountains, the Rocky Mountains, that when the glacial ice moves further south, the cordilleran ice sheet becomes a prominent feature of the habitat, and that will end up separating east and west populations, which has also been very apparent, as we'll see when we get to some maps. And this is another example of a post-glacial distribution. Obviously, this whole range was under ice, so everything that's here is obviously a product of something that was south of the glaciers moving north, and this is a fairly common distribution pattern that we'll see. And then the last is the refugial. You can see that if we, you see where the ice was, and you can see where the ice-free area was, and you see such a distribution pattern as this, then it's very easy to, it's less, let's just say it's more parsimonious to assume that this range distribution is a product of dispersal from this ice-free area than it is to say that this was all south of the ice and it moved north and it's inhospitable and from an area that's now inhospitable to it. I think it's easier to see that this Arctic distributions actually have a refugial origin. Okay. Now we have to do a little review. All right. Basic butterfly behavior is an important function of dispersal. You can say something like food plant assemblages are important. If food plants are spotty, butterflies move from one plant to the next, especially females, because we all know that males are useless bags of sperm. Females will, I didn't even get a chuckle over that. That's a first.
We all know that.
We all know that. So now imagine that you had a little clump of food plants here and another little clump over here and another little over here. Now, maybe they'll all spend all their lives, in this little clump, but, probably not. Female maybe get blown away and there's another little clump over here, another one, they get blown over here. And in the course of the season, if the total population, if you were able to measure, 2,000 individuals from a complete population from the time their eggs were laid to the adult flying, and you found out that the average dispersal from any given colony was 50 meters. Well, times 10,000 years, that's moving. That's movement. So, the ability even to move at small scales locally can imply the ability to move large scales geographically. Hilltopping is another example. A virgin female goes to a hilltop to get mated because males are congregating there, and the hilltop is, you'd say it's radial. It's just a hilltop with lowlands all around it. It's just as likely to go one way as another, and that adds to the dispersibility. And then, of course, other mate locating behaviors. Perching, not so much, but patrolling. If males are patrolling, they come across a female, and females move from an area. Males, again, are fairly useless indicators of dispersibility. But this is very important, Okay, now you have intra-habitat dispersal that takes place as a product of both food plants, mating areas, and nectar sources. Now imagine this is a little clump here, and you put another one over here, and you put one over here. You can imagine that through all these different activities, since a function of the biology of these creatures is moving from food plant to nectar source to mating areas, they're moving all the time. It's not so hard to imagine that, well, they go to another nectar source over here that's part of another clump, or another one over here. Dispersal then becomes a function of these species behavior. And again, the whole nectar on the bottom of a hill and mating areas on top, food plants in the middle. Anytime that you increase intra-habitat movement, then you've increased the ability of that species, or any creature, but especially butterflies, to disperse and to move. The 50 meters a year might become 1,000 meters a year, and they multiply that by 10,000 years, and it's not hard to imagine, transcontinental movement. And we already know that the small white butterfly managed that in less than 100 years. So there you are. Now, seasonal migration is an interesting thing. Dr. David James and I are working on a project together studying Spirea coronis, the coronis spirillary, because it has a very interesting phenomenon. It's pretty much it's not quite like this. The food plants are all in the desert. They move in the spring up through the summer to the top of the mountains and even over to western Washington. And then in late summer and fall, we're getting reports all the way through September in and around Kittitas County and the lowlands in Chelan County of the adults moving back down and laying their eggs. Okay, so that's a dispersal event. It's a return, and you can say, well, how much dispersal is actually going on? Well, who knows? I mean, if things would change and adults went over the top, they could go down on the other side, find violence there, and maybe survive if the climate was sufficient to allow them to do so. But it's very normal for a couple of our species to have yearly resident populations in one part of the state that disperse ultimately across the whole state. Orange sulfurs, we see them all the way to Bellingham, but they don't generally survive winters in western Washington, with some exceptions. Most of the time they're surviving just in this area. So the fact that they can disperse that much, however, gives them a leg up on overall dispersal over time. And this is one of our classic butterflies, the California tortoiseshell, that moves in huge numbers uphill when it has boom years, uphill to the very top, exploiting the food plant at an optimal time for the food plant use, which is it's a plant high in tannins. So apparently it's nice to get in before the tannins kick your butt, And then another one has the same basic strategy, moving uphill each summer. And this is the butterfly that we're going to be working on. It's the Cronus filare. It does the same thing. But the idea is to express what dispersal can actually do for you over the long term. I don't know why that cut off the top. I may have cropped my slides a little bit more than I wish. But at any rate, this is a butterfly that probably didn't have this range aboriginally. It's even hard to say if that's true or not, because an 1881 survey shows that it was in Washington by that time. But it's a butterfly that moves. It's the orange sulfur, and alfalfa is a primary food plant, and that has been grown agriculturally for hundreds of years. So it's really hard to tell just how widespread this was, originally. This is a butterfly we know is not resident in the Northwest, but here it is distributed all the way up. I think there's even records for Alaska. So in a given year, they can move all the way from the Sonoran Desert to Alaska. And again, as a migratory creature, exploiting resources and then and removing itself. And again, the same with this butterfly, the Danaeus plexipus, the monarch. Okay. Every once in a while, you guys all use scientific names, and you don't know what they are. You have to fill in the gaps. Some of them I don't know the common names for.
Last one you neglected to mention was the painted lady.
Yeah, the painted lady. Right. Did everybody know it was a painted lady? All right. You did. Well, you didn't pipe up either. All right. These butterflies don't live here, but they get here every year. Now, why? Well, there is the potential for them, if the climate changes, to find a home here. I mean, the thing is, you have to look at things in terms of potential, because weirder things have happened. Okay, now, we're going to talk about refugial distributions. We talk about how the Arctic refugium allowed Arctic distributions across the harshest climates in North America. I mean, even harsher than, the Sonoran Desert or even the Mojave. Some of them are absolutely desolate places. Okay, this is the Beringian refugium here. And this is Coleus nastis, which somebody, I don't know why, type localities from Labrador, so they call it the Labrador sulfur. Anyone who's tried to catch them calls them nasty sulfurs. They fly about this far off the ground uphill, and I've never seen one go downhill. It's just unending supply of butterflies downhill flying to the tops of the hills. You get to the tops of the hills, they're not there anymore. I don't know what it is. And they always fly faster than I can run, even when I was not so robust. You like that word, robust? All right. Now, this is the distribution in Canada. This is taken from the butterflies of Canada. And you can see that it's pretty high Arctic, okay? What you do see is this distribution down the Rocky Mountains. And this is, as far as it gets, this is from the Mono website, and this is as far as it gets into continental United States. And this is this distribution in BC. Well, now this is interesting because what this really implies, if you back up the line here, is that there is this distribution in the Arctic directly from the refugium. Then there's distribution in the southern Rocky, or the central Rocky Mountains that almost reflects a vicarious event, okay? And that's actually probably the case. We don't know that. Nobody's done a molecular study on this, but these populations here are probably the result of one invasion into this region, and then they may hanging out maybe in that refugium, that corridor we were talking about. Well, the ice sheets came, and then subsequent to that, this reunification of ranges. Okay, but nonetheless, it's still. I mean, these things very likely came from that same refugium in a previous glaciation. I can say it's probably a guesswork on our part, but it seems very likely. And this is a butterfly that we were just talking about a little while ago. It's Beloria Astarte, a lesser fritillaria. Did I not say the common name of this one? Yeah, I did.
You did.
Yeah. And this is a high Arctic butterfly as well. Not as high Arctic as the Arctic fritillaria, but this has a distribution that's largely restricted to the western part, widely distributed in Arctic, eastern Arctic Asia. But again, you see this whole thing here is this distribution to the south. And as you can see again in these maps, another distribution to the south, very similar to the last, and actually representing probably something of the same phenomenon. These populations are probably the product of a previous dispersal event, and then these populations here are the southernmost dispersers of the more recent dispersal event from the refugium. And they're very different looking creatures, so much so that people thought that they were different species. Ironically, these things here from our region, fly up at Slate Peak, are very, very similar to things from southern portions of central Siberia. So it seems to be that their actual phenotype, the reason they look so different, is more a product of latitudinal and or temperature and or moisture gradients. These things are responding similarly to similar habitats. Okay, this is one of my favorite butterflies. It's Aeneas melissa. Melissa's Arctic. It's like brown.
Brown.
Yeah. And that's like brown with little flecks, right? And they're totally cool butterflies. They live on rocks that look brown, yeah, moss lichens and stuff like that, and they're really, really, in rocky habitats. Now, their distribution in Canada reflects some of what we've seen before. Oops. Well, come on now, be on my side. So again, we've got a distribution that's very Arctic, and then a distribution that has this peninsular effect down into the continental United States. Although these are, aside from one population in New Hampshire, these are the only continental records. And you might say, in fact, that the New Hampshire record is very interesting because it is a glacial relic. The nearest population is to it or all the way in Labrador. So at a time when, the glaciers were pushing south, there were populations south of the glaciers, probably as a product of other dispersal events. that did survive in the high mountains and the White Mountains, as a matter of fact, of New Hampshire. So these, again, probably reflect a past dispersal event, and then this is a more recent dispersal event. It's a pattern that recurs so often that we start to feel comfortable with that notion, which is probably a mistake, you know. This is the Arctic blue, am I right? Glandon, they call it the Arctic blue. And this is a fascinating butterfly in as much as it has some of the same characteristics of the other butterflies and distributions we've talked about. It has this pan-Arctic, all the way into Lapland, just like the Arctic fritillary. And then it has extensive populations in the lowlands of the prairies, and it extends well into the Cascades and into the Rocky Mountains. So this is a butterfly that actually is its current distribution is, reflects dispersal, vicariance, and redispersal, reintegration. Okay, now I wrote something specifically about it, but it has it's an Arctic montane with adaptations to steppe prairie. Now, when I was in the Yukon, we found these things flying in habitats just like you find at Reeser Creek. You had Parnassus smintheus, Euphydrius anicia, Parnassus smintheus, the Smintheus parnassian, the Anicia checker spot, is that right? And I think maybe one other butterfly that was almost identical to what you find at Reeser Creek. But with the caveat, there were these little Arctic blues all over the place. So they have made this adaptation. And again, it seems to be exactly a case of the Arctic, or the alpine timberline and the low elevation timberlines conjoining and allowing this dispersal between the two, because the structural aspect of both the Arctic and the alpine tundras is identical, and the food plants are available in both, either at the genus level or at the family level. But this is especially interesting. Let's go back to this. This is the distribution of this species in the continental United States. It has a vicariant in California and southern Oregon. This is a butterfly who experienced the same kind of dispersal event, but it managed to get down into California. Now that must have been, during a time when the climate was actually much different, or possibly there was dispersal across the Great Basin. That's, nobody really knows, because whatever, it was a long time ago, and these butterflies have become different species. And therefore, it obviously very similar species, but there's no doubt about there being distinct species. That's what can happen when vicariance occurs.
What was that species, John?
Podarchy, Plebius podarchy. Sorry.
No, it's...
Yeah, I don't know what the common name is. I mean, it's tempting to say podarchy blue,
Yeah.
Okay, now we have distributions that are boreal, and we use that word as different from Arctic, because strictly Arctic is at the edge of the northern tree line, and conceivably, into the high Arctic. But boreal includes everything in between that and the prairies and the cordilleran regions, and that's essentially this whole region here. Okay. This butterfly is our Oregon swallowtail, which is considered to be Papilio McCann, the old world swallowtail. And we all, we know and love this butterfly. We think of it as a steppe butterfly. But in fact, it's pan-boreal. It occurs across all of Eurasia and the whole Arctic, with extensions into temperate North Africa and even into the Himalayas. So it has the capacity to adapt. It's not especially montane. It is in many places montane, but it's adapted also to steppe, as witnessed the Oregon swallowtail, as well as tundra. And it's possible that that these things are actually it actually represents what might be called a superspecies. In other words, a species whose internal complexity is more differentiated than a normal species. It has components of several different events of differentiation, and between which they're all the same species, but they're all kind of a little different, in some ways. It's an intermediate concept between species and subspecies, and it's finding more utility, at least as a term enabling communication. Well, this is the distribution in Canada, and this includes several different subspecies. This is very typical of the old world subspecies. This thing really actually looks like things you get in Britain. These things in here are kind of a different sort of thing, reflecting influences from other in the McCain group, which includes the black swallowtail, etc. And then these things in here are actually more like Oregonians. Well, the the continental United States distribution reflects, that it's not found in some of these places that are extremely dry. Maybe these are under collected too, but it has quite a penetration. You think about the mass that we just looked at, and it's all the way to the Arctic coast in Alaska and the Yukon, all the way to the Mexican border. So it's a butterfly you have to consider very, very adaptable. But again, pretty much restricted to the western United States. And again, that's the distribution from the butterflies of BC, which is, by the way, online. That's where I got these images. This is a butterfly called Beloria bellona. Is that meadow fritillary?
Wait, Beloria, which one?
Bellona? Come on.
No, that's not Western Meadow.
Not the western meadow.
Western Meadow, but it's-
Just the meadow fritillary. Okay, this is another butterfly that has, this is like what I would call a classic boreal distribution. Into the taiga and penetrating the prairies to some degree, and then actually all the way up into the Yukon. It's a forest species with an adaptation to the steppe prairie transition zone. That's where we find them in Washington. It has a tremendous penetration into the eastern United States. A lot of people think that it's really become much more common there because it is a denizen of old fields, otherwise called waste areas, So it is a trashy butterfly, my favorite kind. These are its distribution in Washington, and these are pretty uncommon down here. I'm pretty sure that these haven't been duplicated. This actually has, I think, but it's not so uncommon up here, and certainly it's not so uncommon in this area. These are butterflies that have penetrated into our part of the world from the boreal distribution, which suggests that they actually came essentially from eastern United States to get here. And then this is Beloria freya.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a nice one. Off the Butterflies of America. David Shaw's our own. He's a Seattle doctor, you know him. And again, a typical boreal distribution. Pretty high in the Arctic as well. It barely gets into the United States, and this distribution reflects a relictual distribution of a previous dispersal event, whereas this and this are part of the same boreal element. And again, you can see, the same, kind of things, penetration from the south, barely getting into the state from the north. We'll see that there's from the north, and there's from the south, and there's relatively few that are our own homegrown. But, yeah, go ahead.
The name, Classiana?
Oh, that's, this thing here,
Yeah.
that's just John Shepard, that's Beloria. It's splitters, lumpers, what are you going to do with them?
Is that a splitter or a lumper?
That's a splitter. And he's not normally a splitter, but Beloria, there's a rule amongst systematists, if you're interested in the group, it's likelier to be split, Is that not so, Rod?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm a more of a splitter at species level and more of a lumper at higher category, so you never know.
I'm sure glad I asked. Okay, now, the interesting thing about this distribution is that this has happened apparently more than once. I mean, there's been all kinds of movement from the glacial refugium, and maybe boreal elements, who really knows, because there is a sibling species in this group, and this is fascinating. This is a normal Freya lesser fritillary. They just call it the Freya fritillary. They don't call it the Freya lesser fritillary. And this is its sister, and this is called Beloria nadajati. Some people call it the relic fritillary. Isn't that a cool creature? And it's even cooler on the underside. And this is a normal Freya fritillary, and this is the nadajati. And
Say that name again?
nadajati. Nadajati. Come on, man. Natazhati. It's Russian. Yeah. It's from Mount Nadajat, and I'm sure you needed to know that. The cool thing about this is you can't see is the size difference. The Freya is about maybe an inch across. These things are almost 2 inches. The first one I ever saw in my life I thought was an Arabia because it just was humongous. It was too big for a lesser Fred. But so that shows you that, you know, this is the magnitude of what differentiation can lead to. Okay, now, amazingly, we're talking about what butterfly? Come on, Heidi. That's right. This is the baby we was talking about. I thought this is a certain irony. That's kind of cool. This is a butterfly's distribution is both high Arctic, as Heidi was saying, penetrating well to the south, and as you can see, well into you know, portions of the Northeast, well into the Rocky Mountains. Again, the product of several dispersal pulses from these refugia. And again, what you can see here is the differentiation. We'll look at images. Our Rainieri and these Butleri things, these are basically the same. These things are wacko things, and it's part of as I say here, a highly adapted to vicariance, a bog fan adaptation and an Arctic alpine tundra adaptation. Ours are the Arctic alpine tundra. These here are also, they're found at high elevations, and it's only when you get up to here that they're found actually at sea level along, and again, that's a merging of the two tree lines, okay? But the two phenotypes are actually remarkably different, okay? This is the Arctic alpine thing, and this is the bog dwelling thing, and you can see there's elements in the patterns that are the same. And what's really fascinating, if I had more time, I'd go in. Oh, these actually, in terms of how different they appear here, if I had more time, I would have had 30 or 40 images up there and show that in places in the Yukon and in Alaska and all across, let's go back to the big map here, all across this area here, they all merge. So there's no doubt about the fact that there are two different phenotypes, but there's also no doubt about the fact that they're conspecific. It's only when you get into the Yukon that you get really remarkable things happening. Well, actually, you can see it in this map here. You've got these things here, which are almost exactly like our Rainieri, but then in the low elevations all around them, you've got those other bog-dwelling things that are dark, smudgy looking, you know, not nearly the same kind of creature at all. And yeah, but they don't have anything to do with each other ecologically. It's because where they converge is elsewhere on the planet. So if you were just living in this region, you'd think, well, it's easy. They're two different species. But you know, when you have a more comprehensive look, and that's what a biogeographer is required to do, you can see that they're part of the same species complex. Okay. Oh, this is another one of our Washington butterflies. I used most butterflies that were in Washington. This is Bloria selene, the bog fritillary. Is that right? Bog fritillary? Come on!
It's got a lot of different.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, we'll go with bog fritillary. I mean, you know, it's a widely distributed species as well. This is panboreal, that means across both hemispheres. A bog fen species, and it's narrowly limited to that habitat. But interestingly enough, in the boreal area, bog fens are incredibly common. You know, a bog might extend for, you know, almost 50 square miles. So, like, that's a perfect place for a butterfly like this. Who is that guy? Anybody know that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's our buddy from Spokane. And this is again just again perfectly. You know, it's like I showed you the map and I showed the boreal distribution. Well, this is, you know, been showing you map after map with the same kind of pattern. So it's like, you know, we're not making this stuff up. It actually exists. This, in this case, it again extends further south, but you can see, if you look at the two maps of the distribution, this is an extension south from that boreal distribution. It may actually be that these populations represent populations that were there during glaciation, and they are the ancestral ones, and the ones in the north are the ones that were colonized, but that's neither here nor there.
Or there could have been both.
Huh?
It could have been both.
Probably, yeah, probably. The process of dispersal does not eliminate the possibility for differentiation, absolutely. And this is the distribution in the Northwest. You can see, if you went further south here, you wouldn't see any spots. So this is pretty much the southernmost distribution in the Northwest. There's another butterfly that gets here from the north and not further south. And yeah, this is the hoary elfin. Is that right? Can I say hoary? Is that PC?
It's as in frost.
Oh, it's in frost. Oh, all this time I thought it was something
Yeah,
much worse.
sure.
All right. This is a food plant limited species, and so that imposes itself on their range. It feeds on Arctostaphylos uva. It's boreal, but not Arctic. Forest species, right? Kinnikinnick, yeah. You didn't know what Arctostaphylos uva was?
I did, that's why I said Kinnikinnick.
This is penetrating into montane areas, mostly in the Rockies. Here's, again, that familiar boreal distribution pattern. Obviously penetrating pretty well into the Rockies and then along the East Coast. This is probably relictual. In other words, it was probably more widely distributed at one time and either became extinct as a product of climatic change or human induced. And those damn humans, they get in the way of everything natural. And this is distribution in the Northwest. Now, there's one more dot further south in California, but this is essentially as far south as it gets. And again, repeating the pattern of the boreal distribution that barely gets into our part of the world. Now we're going to get into strictly western United States. This is a butterfly that we all know and love, Papilio swallowtail. I mean, I think it's a pretty cool butterfly myself. And you can see its total range, if you exclude the little bit that's up here in BC, is in the western United States. And this looks like it gets all the way into Baja California. That's not so. It gets in right here. But that's the problem with Pomona maps, is that they do it county-wise, and some of those counties are huge. So its distribution in the Northwest, and it's obvious that we talked about the boreal distribution barely getting. Well, this is a reverse. This is a distribution from the west that just barely gets into BC, and it's really interesting because it's not an uncommon butterfly in the right places in Washington, but the only place it's found in BC is adjacent Slate Peak at the highest elevations. It doesn't get up the Okanagan River Valley at all. So, and this is a butterfly that probably came to this state after the glaciers and just barely made it into. This is into BC. This is another butterfly. It's the Chloe asonides. Interesting butterfly in that it's a member of a whole Arctic group. And in fact, if you went to Europe, you would see these butterflies and say, hey, it looks like asonides. I mean, they're very, very similar butterflies flying in Italy and France and most of southern Europe. And yet, it is a very distinctive element, barely getting into the boreal region at all. It's a good disperser. So this range reflects, the ability for it to disperse. It may be that these things here, Ogilvia is the name of the Ogilvy Mountains in Yukon. So it may be that that's a refugial population that sustained through the last glaciation, and then subsequently they're very similar butterflies anyway. So it's not like the most interesting thing is there's another little endemic thing here. That's the Insulana that's up there in the San Juans and the Vancouver Island. And that is actually probably a product of dispersal during a period of time when these butterfly populations occupied the Puget Trough. Now, I would be interested in doing molecular work, because I suspect that these things here actually have more to do with things you can't see in Oregon, down here, that they're a product of actual coastal distribution. Or
coastal refugia.
Well, right, because we've got some others, Yeah, so, but, until we actually do that work, it's going to be pretty hard to ascertain. Now we get into checker spots, and I mean, wow, what a mess. These are cool. These are the Colin snowberry checker spot, Amphidrias colin. And we're going to get into one of the problems with checker spots generally, is that, who's that? Oh, yeah. And this is a distribution for the variable checker spot. At the time when no one was differentiating all of them. That's the combination of 3 different checker spots into one distribution pattern, okay? This is what they had for identified colon, and that's just a problem because actually colon distribution includes all of this area. In fact, our BC map shows a better distribution. Now, that is a vicariant event that we don't understand very much about right now because its relationships to Chalcedona have obfuscated, things that have happened in the past. So we're in the process of figuring it out. Most important thing is to recognize that this is a western butterfly that has really dispersed, actually there's Yukon populations now. It's dispersed quite a ways up north, which reflects that there must be some kind of a conduit, some kind of a dispersal corridor that we're not familiar with. And then this is Edith's checker spot. These two are Taylor's. You know Fred, right?
No.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And then has, again, a western distribution, which is really pretty fascinating, very differentiated throughout this region, and it's again, reaching its, upwards. This is as far north as it gets, right in here. And highly differentiated, probably, it's a complex of semi-species. In fact, it may be a superspecies, there may be more than one, but it's basically all the way from alpine to steppe habitats. Even in Washington, you have populations from the Puget Prairies, San Juan, Straits of San Juan, right above the salt spray, all the way to like Slate Peak, well above timberline. Oh, I don't know if I forgot to tell you that if you have questions, you can ask them. It didn't seem that you were hesitating. But, this is the arrowhead blue, Wakasaki piasis. If you notice that these maps, one after the next, you're just like, wow, they're all kind of like in the same ballpark. Well, that's because there's another conformity around a pattern of distribution, which reflects a basic continuity of a proximity to a cause, all right? And again, barely getting into Canada, we are near the north limit of this distribution. Hesperia Nevada, the Nevada branded skipper, is that right?
Nevada skipper.
Nevada skipper. Such an original. I would have called it like super cool green ventral hindwing skipper. Right. While this distribution pattern is quite like the others, it's not even accurate in as much as if you actually see the dots. They're highly clustered in very sporadic fashion. And behavior is an important factor in this, and maybe that may be as important as anything in terms of finding them. It may be more widespread. Its behavior is so unusual. Cupreus, Lycina cupreus, the lustrous copper. Man, that's amazing. Picking this stuff up, not bad for an old guy. Huh? This is a butterfly that's very interesting in that it has two vicariant populations as well. And you just saw examples of the two. Dorsally, you have kind of a warm coppery color. Ventrally, see this nice orange and it's a warm color. Whereas this is a colder, and you see how pale lemon that is. One is the typical cupreus, and the other is what they call the snow white. And we get in this, this is its total distribution in continental United States, and we'll get it into BC and Canada in a minute. But this actually reflects two very possibly distinct species. The true cupreus occurs in this region into Montana and into California in this area. Snow white occurs all the way up into here. That's what we get in our state is the snow white types. And you can see that this distribution is actually pretty discrete. They overlap in Montana, but one's on top of the other. One's in the alpine snow screeds, and the others in montane meadows. So the interesting thing about that, going back to here, is why isn't it in Washington? There's a lot of habitats that it occurs in Oregon that should be over here, where again, that's actually a barrier. And where it gets over here is across the Ochoco Gap into the northeast corner of Oregon. It's understandable, but there's one more county that's not on this map. Okay, Edith's copper. This is a cool butterfly because it's expanding its range. I actually better pick up the pace here. All right. Now we'll just look at these pictures. That's Edith's copper, Lysina editha. And again, the same kind of thing. It gets across into the Rocky Mountains by way of the Ochoco Gap in Oregon. It does catch the southeast corner of Washington, but now we know that it's actually all through here. It's expanding its range. This is a butterfly that human activity has probably helped. It's it feeds on weedy rumex and you know, like what's the root common? Acetosella, is that the common one? Yeah. What is the common name for that? Sheep sorrel?
I like to call it sourdock.
Sourdock,
Dock
yeah.
in there in the south.
Right. So it just, you know, I think a lot of us were at Tiger Meadows when there was cotton for the county record. Well, now it's like dirt common in Tiger Meadows. It's just everywhere, and it's expanding its range into other counties. So, again, primarily western distribution. It doesn't get into BC, although it will be shortly. All right. Huh?
Coming soon.
Coming soon to you, like Campastus. This is Coleus alexandra. That's a cool butterfly. Coleus alexandra. Again, a western distribution with extensions into Canada. Just repeating the theme, okay? Colophus affinis, the immaculate green hair streak. I picked a fairly immaculate specimen to show. Probably the same specimen now that I look at it. No, maybe not. They're not always immaculate. This is another problem with green hair streaks, is that this is the distribution of the immaculate green hair streak according to one criterion, and this is one of the components of it on the Pomona site. But in actual fact of the matter, the real immaculate green hair streak is a western butterfly with a pattern very similar to what we've been seeing. The butterfly formerly known as Perplexa is going to have its name changed back. We have an application to the ICZ, and it's going to make it Colophus dumatorum forevermore. Let's hear it for that, huh? Yeah. You don't even know what that's about. Well, there's Rocky Mountains as a product of dispersal, obviously post-glacial, because that's the pattern that it shows is, you know, the glaciers left it, moved over into the Rocky Mountains. This is our only endemic Pacific Northwest butterfly. No, you don't count. Somebody? Fiddlers and what?
Arabia.
Fiddler. We'll just go with that. You got Arabia, that's pretty cool. Yeah, Fiddler's alpine, Arabia, Fiddlerite. This is just total range in the world. The cool thing about this butterfly is that its closest relationships are in Asia. I mean, the butterflies most closely related to it are in the Far East. Yeah, you got a question?
No.
I hope not. You're usually trouble, you know what I'm saying? You ask me something I have no idea. Now, this is a butterfly called the red spotted purple or the white admiral, but they're all the same species. And what we're going to do is go through a couple of slides here. You can see that this is the white admiral, this is the hybrid, this is the, well, they're not really hybrids because they perfectly blend into one another. Okay, and then as an example of that, I'm going to go through a bunch of slides here. Okay, I'm just going to slide through, something like that. And
John?
Yeah.
The cool thing about these closely related lemonitis, they have different visual pigments.
Do they?
Yeah.
Is it related?
We're working on this.
Yeah. Is it related to systematics of the group at all? Or is it to the
Well,
mimicry?
if the systematics were actually understood, we don't know. I don't know.
Oh, all right. Well, no,
We're trying to figure that out.
they're pretty well understood, but it'll be interesting to see how your results, parallel them.
Yeah.
I mean, basically what we have here is a series of images that show, for instance, a typical white admiral with not so typical white admiral. These are all actually taken in the same place. Right. So it's like there's a little question of what's going on here. A little hanky-panky think, huh? And
Viceroy's in there.
huh? Well, that could happen. Viceroy's. That's why we don't have a problem with these things, doing the little hanky-panky because viceroys, which obviously is a distinct species from all of them, will also do the same thing and hybridize with all these other species. And they don't look so tidy. The adults are really wacko. But
Is there any separation by gender in those photos? Do males?
No, I think we flipped them. There's that's a female, that's a male. That's a female, that's a male. I mean, they're just,
Wow,
yeah.
okay.
Remington has some gyrandamorphs in these things.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, when you get a andromorph in the hybrids, it's really weird looking, yeah. Now, these are the white-banded, and these are the red-spotted. And you can see that there's actually a lot of overlap. And of course, you know where we got the sample. It was right there. You see, that's where you get those whacked out things. Now, it turns out that the red-spotted purples are highly associated with the range of Batis phylonor, the pipeline swallowtail. And in fact, they converge on that pattern, that reflecting blue, non-limonitine pattern is definitely more like the phylonor. And so, highly selected for in that range. But I'm almost done, guys. Wanted to get through this is Papilio canadensis, the Canadian tiger swallowtail. And we get these barely into our state. You know, they don't show these spots. So they have these little purple spots that they call C. canadensis crossed with rurulus. But you know, you guys may have seen Dave Nunley's specimen he brought down here, and we get them with some frequency in the Similkameen and in that region. And then this is, of course, our western tiger swallowtail. You can see that there's really some dramatic differences if you look at these orange spots here, and then this orange on this portion of the wing. They're just they're not orange, and there's just no orange there. That's pretty clear. That's pretty clear. And then this is the distribution of rudderless. Should jump back. There's the distribution of canadensis. So you can see there's really quite a bit of overlap, and the amount of intergradation is not great, and the individuals that are integrated are not numerous. So they're pretty obviously distinct species with a tendency to mismate. Now we have here two range maps, okay, and this is Papilio glaucus, which is the east. That wasn't bothering me at all. This is the eastern tiger swallowtail, and this, and this is the western tiger swallowtail. And you can see how,
Sure.
yeah, and see how they're almost exactly opposite one another, but not quite. And in the areas where they come into contact, well, these are the product. In fact, all three, the Canadian tiger swallowtail very probably was in the Arctic refugium. Western tiger swallowtail is very largely isolated west of the Rocky Mountains. Eastern tiger swallowtail very likely was isolated east of the Rocky Mountains during glacial maxima. The last one or the one before that, who knows? But and these are the product of vicariant evolutionary events. There we go. So I only have one.
Dinner's ready.
What was that? Did I do that? I wanted to say one more thing, okay, and that is this thing called phylogeography. This is going to be really cool. This is where we become so facile with molecular techniques that we're able to employ them at the local level, all right? So that we can go from one ridgetop to the valley to the next ridgetop to the valley and get nice gene sequences. We're not interested in specific identities here. We're interested in lineages. And we will know immediately if we have different lineage because the relationships established from one ridge to the next will immediately show when we get to one that's different from that. Now, we'd expect to see some variation because life is like that, variable. But the interesting thing is that with this technique, we will be able to see some real evidence of past events, and they will be traceable through the molecular lineage. It's a new science. It's very sexy. It's almost as cool as conservation biology. All right, any questions? Yeah.
Is trashy habitat the key to dispersal?
Well, not necessarily, but certainly anticlimax is. Because anything that destroys a climax, creates opportunities. And so, like, yes, in a way, if you can imagine trashy habitat before Europeans, all right, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's riverine habitat where floods occur frequently. It's avalanche slopes. It's those kinds of habitats. So yeah, in a sense, trashy habitats are key. But the old field habitat, it's turning out to be very, very interesting, especially in the eastern United States. Agricultural fields that have just lain fallow and start to grow back with no attention turn out to be really, really good places for a lot of creatures. And studying that phenomenon will open our eyes to the conservation priorities and maybe how to attain some of the objectives that we might have. Yeah. Any more? Yeah.
I appreciate that you kind of centered all of this around us basically in a very large way. And a lot of it's about ice. But if you did all of this talk and it was about Ecuador or someplace, would that be relatively boring by comparison? Because it's just tropical. And this is out on that edge, as you were saying, which is interesting.
Well, I would say this. First of all, if I gave a talk about Ecuadorian butterflies, it would be fantastic. And I mean that in the truest sense of that word, because I'd be making it up. All right. But I would say that my Ecuadorian friends tell me that Ecuador is an amazing place with diversity montane to sea level that's the equivalent of anything we have. You see, it's a different magnitude. So I would say, yeah, a lot of people would say that, that the paraglacial habitats are most interesting. Certainly in Russia, the Russians think so. They're interesting in that we have absolute bottom line. There are no butterflies under the ice. So we can start from this point. Anything that's there now happened in this amount of time, so we can say something absolutely. So, but no, I think it's interesting everywhere. I was going to say...
Aren't there blues down there that came from Russia?
What's that?
Aren't there blues down there that came from Russia?
Oh, you've been reading the wrong stuff, man. No, they didn't come from Russia. The ones in Russia came from there.
Oh, okay.
No, there was, that was basic butterfly biology. We had my or biogeography. We had my basic butterfly biology. My next two are going to be intermediate butterfly biology, intermediate butterfly biogeography, where we encompass more global aspects.
John, do you have any examples you could share with us where the genetic tools that you were describing have been applied to particular species? And can you share with us what has been learned about the range over time? Well,
it's there's three species that have been examined, all of them European. One is Erebia tenderis, which is a really interesting butterfly because it's almost all, everybody's leaving. Oh, shoot. All right. It's very interesting because it belongs to a complex of species that maybe 12 of them altogether that are largely differentiable on the basis of chromosome alone. So they were very interested in looking at these things and seeing what the differences were biochemically between them and tenderis, and then especially what the relationships were between various tenderis populations, because all of these are exceedingly colonial. They don't form parts of metapopulations. It's like each colony is on an isolated ridge somewhere, right? And what they showed was a remarkable uniformity. So that's what you'd expect, for instance, if you went from ridge to ridge to ridge in Washington. You went to Wenatchee Mountains, you went to Aniat Ridge, and you did sampling like that. And that's, I mean, in terms of if you're going to predict beforehand. As to whether or not any of those things actually represent historical events, you can't be sure. But, certainly if you were going from ridge to ridge to ridge, and then you got to like the Okanagan Valley, and then all of a sudden you got the Okanagan Highlands, and whoa, you had a whole different, genetic arrangement. I mean, you're looking at something there that's more significant. That's what you're really looking for, not the conformity to a pattern, but the discordance to a pattern. And so, yeah, nobody's really, well, they're doing it, but it hasn't been published. Yeah. And they're really not doing it in the Northwest, unfortunately. I mean, I don't know why this is the best place in the world, because there's no butterflies. And so the ones you got, you have to really work hard for, and you get the riches that way. But, all right, any more questions? Oh, yeah, Heidi?
Yeah, with the possibility of global warming, do you see the spread vertical or horizontal?
First of all, there is no such thing as global warming. Man, don't you ever watch Fox News? Global warming, it should be climate change, and that's not happening either.
That's not happening either.
Yeah, no, I suspect that, of course, the ultimate effect of global warming is glaciation. You know that, don't you? Because you warm, you melt, and you cut off all these currents that warm the oceans, all right? And you create a new glacial epoch. I don't know that either. Nobody does. But I wouldn't say that we can make those kind of predictions. We had a lady talk about Adelopes campestris saccum and its invasion of Northwest as a product of global warming. Or, she kind of
Climate change,
Climate change, right?
Lisa.
Yeah, she suggested that. I think that it's perilous to claim such a thing. You don't know. Yeah, you'd expect that if it got warmer, that things that were warm adapted would take advantage of warmer climates. But really, the whole place has been undersampled, and so we don't know that just more eyes looking hasn't been a part. In the case of the Sachem, I think it's obvious that it's done something, but it could be just adaptational. It might not have anything to do with actual climate change, because I don't think that it's adapted to enduring as bad a weather as it's had to endure the last couple of years, and yet it has endured. So that's pretty much a historical factor. We've seen it move in through Oregon and into Washington, and I think it's an adaptational thing. Everything wants to survive. Everything will do everything it can to survive, and that's an example. Yeah. This isn't going to be hard, is it?
I was just going to enlarge on the same question. I remember reading a study comparing locality records of European butterflies over approximately 100 years. In Europe, they can do that. And as I recall, they found that the vast majority had shifted about 100 kilometers north or so over that period of time.
That was the work by Dennis, right?
I don't remember anything more about it. I'd have to look it up.
Well, actually, that's subject to some of the same problems. I don't discredit him. I just say that anytime people start talking about global kinds of things, they operating on data they don't have, because we just haven't been around.
There are some spider species that have shifted their distribution northward, like in the last 25 years or so, and there was no earthly reason why they couldn't have done it sooner, except for climate change.
Well, wait a minute, there's another earthly reason. How many people collect spiders? How do you know they weren't there?
I mean, nobody's going to fail to notice Archaeopia aurantia if it was there.
You say that, but I bet you half the people here don't know.
They might not know what the hell it is, but they'll notice it.